Reverend Carpenter, I think we're getting a little too comfortable with one another around here. I just want you to know I don't like it, all right? I love it, is what I do. Last week, I mentioned you, Reverend Carpenter and Reverend East, saying that if this continues, as I alluded to, actually, I believe you at our house, I want a corner office. I'd like a reserved parking spot.
You got it. But then we're gonna have office hours.
All right, the deal's off. Did I might have shared with you funny some things that you remember during your years of school. It doesn't matter if it's elementary or high school or college or what have you. I had a class, I'll never forget, a teacher who would come in with military precision. He would sit down at the desk. He didn't stand up and lecture. He looked at his watch. He opened his material. He began lecturing. He asked for a question or two at the end of his presentation and systematically walked out. And it was just, he was a fabulous teacher, but he was so disciplined. He was so structured. We're already, 5 minutes late into starting. Folks, what I would like to share with you is that we'll continue this class for 2 more sessions in January. And my preparation for today is based in part on that. Let me be more precise. Last week, naturally, chronologically, we began our overview of the book of Samuel with Samuel 1. We'll try to finish at least referencing or primarily referencing Samuel 1 today. And then, God willing, January, the 8th and the 15th, those 2 Sundays, sequential Sundays, we'll start looking at the second work of Samuel. All right. And in that way, without burdening you, without unnecessarily elongating the class, at least we'll be able to perhaps more fully explore some of the really high points of this extraordinary book. Let's get down to work. Last week, I gave short shrift to chapter 8, and I want to begin by just going back on chapter 8. So I want us to open up our text. Actually, let me use mine here. Yes, to chapter 8, starting with verse 4. And because we're recording and because I have the microphone to my lapel, I'll read, and you'll notice the translation that I have may differ ever so slightly from your translation. As I've said, any translation is an interpretation. Even if you're a native Hebrew speaker, as we're English speakers and we read English literature, we're still going to interpret it, but all the more so when we're changing or translating one language to another. So we're in 1 Samuel chapter 8, beginning with verse 4. All the elders of Israel assembled and came to Samuel at Ramah. Ramah means the heights. And I said, as a general rule, when you study biblical literature, I think it's very important that you unpack, to the extent that we can, the meaning of particular names of locations, and more centrally, names of individuals. So Ramah means of the heights, Ramoth. And they said to him, you have grown old, and your sons have not followed your ways. Again, a timeless motif without any aspersions, how we do hope, and I mean this most seriously, we do hope our children certainly exemplify the higher points, those things that perhaps we really want to perpetuate. It may be a religious view, a political view, a certain philosophical aesthetic. Whether they do or not, the umbilical cord, as we know, is severed at birth. And we want our children or our nieces and nephews, if we don't have children, or the next generation, to be self-actualized and so on and so forth. I'm sounding a little preachy here, but you get it, all right? Though the theme is timeless, absolutely timeless. My kids don't have interest in the company business, all right? Or they deviated from the norms that we set out for them. You know, Jung makes the comment that very often we live our unlived lives through our children and finding fulfillment from them, which is unfair. It's an unfair burden, all right? It's an important digression because the leitmotif that I would argue interwoven throughout the Bible, and I'm no expert on the Christian Bible, but to the extent that I know it, it's certainly congruent with the Christian Bible every bit as much, is the relevancy of these texts. The themes that are touched on, the depictions that are written about are just substantively the same. Times change, but human nature and human discourse largely remains undiminished. And that's a challenge. Therefore, appoint a king for us to govern us like all the other nations. Samuel was displeased that they said, give us a king to govern us. Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord replied to Samuel, heed the demand of the people and everything they say to you, for it is not you that they have rejected, it is me. Dave, are you familiar, or any of you familiar with Gunther Plaut? Did you ever hear of him? So he was a Bible scholar. He died, oh gosh, probably a healthy 25 years ago. And he lived in Toronto, and dynamic, insightful man, as I remember. And he poses the question, who was the most tragic figure in the Bible? And I was present at his lecture when he asked that question, and people would say Job. Within a Christian gathering, perhaps one of the apostles or Jesus. And, you know, others would say, well, maybe, I don't know, I'm thinking of other tragic, really tragic figures in the Bible. I think Esau in some ways was a tragic figure, all right? And so on down the line. Ezekiel was a tormented figure. Jeremiah was emotionally, proudly depressed, clinically depressed. So he goes around the room and people offer suggestions and he acknowledges them. He says, I think the most tragic figure in the Bible is God. And think about it at every turn of the page. I'm grandstanding here a bit, but certainly the thrust is, oh, really? Or what have you done for me lately? And here is yet another proof positive to Gunther Plaut's insight, which I share with you. They're not rejecting you, Samuel, they're rejecting me with a capital M, and so on down the line. Why do they want a king? And this is where I wanted to open today's session by revisiting this chapter, which question was raised, why did I skip it? And I think it does merit perhaps some greater insight. Why do the people want a king? And by the way, don't just project back into time using the text as a foundation. Why do we want a government? This is a philosophical discussion, is it not? And again, folks, hear me clearly and with the height of respect, whether you find yourself politically on the left of the spectrum or on the right of the spectrum, that is so your business. But it does feather into a person's just narrative, what he or she wants in life, what he or she expects in life. Why do they want a king? Why do the Israelites want a king? The Hebrews, the term Jew comes much later, much later chronologically. It comes from Judah. Judah's the fourth child of Jacob. You can hear the alliteration. Judah and Samaria, the biblical regions of ancient Israel. That term comes later. Why do they want a king? No one's on trial here, but why?
Everybody else has one.
And that is essentially what they say, right? Everyone else has one. Why not us? Yeah.
To keep chaos at bay.
To keep chaos at bay. What else? Yes, sir.
Well, haven't they just had their clocks cleaned by the Philistines?
Yes, yes.
So they sense themselves geopolitically at a disadvantage.
By the way, what is that idiom? Having your clock clean? Isn't that a good thing? You know, we have our windows cleaned. I'm just saying, you know.
They have their sundial cleaned.
Maybe they're water dials, but yeah, yes. And therefore what?
Felt vulnerable.
Yes, protect me, take care of me. And by the way, again, I don't say this with any aspersion. You know, and by the way, that's the philosophical discussion, irrespective of political views, and it's timeless. I can't say it enough. I don't get it. I really don't get the animosity to the Bible, other than to, you know, pick out points in the Bible that are difficult. Anyone who studies the Bible knows this, but I don't understand why this is not seen as a quintessentially relevant text. I don't give a hoot what your religious identity is. It's timeless. It's just timeless. And that's the debate, is it not? How wide should the web be sown? The political web. We want government to take care of us from birth to burial. We want government to stay out of our lives. We want government, whatever it is. Again, it's according to your sensitivities. You get the point. But that's what they want. Yes.
There's another issue that's in the text that we just read, and that is that the people are dissatisfied with the status quo, not with Samuel, but apparently they anticipate a succession which is going to be unfavorable for us. Fair.
Oh,
Isn't that the reference to the son?
I see where you're going with it. Yeah, that's very good. Yes, that's right. We're not happy with who's in the pipeline, Samuel. That's right. Yes. Very good. Very astute point. I thought you were, I misread you initially. I thought they were projecting of you know, no, essentially, no, I misunderstood you. Yes, very good point. Excellent point. No, I concede that point as I thought about interpreting what you were saying. Yeah, very good. That's it. That's essentially it. And they get their way. As a postscript, your feelings about George Washington, General George Washington, I think one of the greatest contributions he made outside of the battlefield was that he declined being a king, essentially. He didn't want to do that. All right. Anyway, I do think that that's a text worthy. You can go and read it, the full chapter. But I think the crux of the matter does deal with the contemporary issue. All right, let's talk about a very depressing subject, the downfall of Saul's kingship. So let's turn forward in your text to chapter 15. Folks, call out a page unless you're using different texts. Are they all the same, pretty much?
246.
And okay, I'm going to start. I'm debating. I'm sorry for the pause here, but you know what? Let's do this. Let's start with chapter 15, verse 1. Samuel said to Saul, I am the one the Lord sent to anoint you king over his people. Therefore, listen to the Lord's command. Thus says the Lord of hosts, I'm exacting the penalty for what Amalek did to Israel for the assault he made upon them on the road on their way up from Egypt. Now go attack Amalek and prescribe all that belongs to him. Spare no one, but kill alike men and women, infants, sucklings, oxen, and sheep, camels, and asses. Pretty harsh decree. All right. Now, is that through the lens of Samuel, or is that the direct initiative of God? That's an apologetic, but not uncommonly when an individual quotes God. Is that the will of the individual? Is that the individual serving as the conduit of God directly to the subject and the object intended? That's an apologetic. How do we get around difficult sections in the Bible? Leaving that important question aside, for the moment at least, the directive is clear. This is retribution against the Amalekites. This is a group of people that takes advantage of the Israelites as they make their way to Promised Land, leaving the hellhole of slavery in Egypt. Okay? Saul mustered, verse 4, chapter 15, mustered the troops and enrolled them at Telaim, 200,000 men on foot and 10,000 men of Judah. Then Saul advanced as far as the city of Amalek and lay in wait in the wadi. All right, let's move forward. Verse 7. Saul destroyed Amalek at Havilah all the way to Shur, which is close to Egypt. And he captured King Agag. The Agagites are Amalekites. He prescribed all the people, putting them to the sword, but Saul and the troops spared Agag and the best of the sheep and oxen, the second born, the lambs, and all else that was of value. They would not prescribe them. They prescribed only what was cheap and worthless. The words of the Lord then came to Samuel, I regret that I made Saul king, for he has turned away from me and has not carried out my commands. Samuel was distressed and he entreated the Lord all night. Early in the morning, Samuel went to meet Saul. Samuel was told Saul went to Carmel, where he erected a monument for himself. Then he left and went down to Gilgal. When Samuel came to Saul, verse 13, Saul said to him, blessed are you of the Lord. I have fulfilled the Lord's command. Then what, demanded Samuel, is this bleating of sheep in my ears and the lowing of oxen that I hear? Saul answered, they were brought from the Amalekites, for the troops spared the choicest of sheep and oxen. You follow the passive-aggressive statement that Samuel asked Saul, oh, you're victorious, and what do I hear in the distance here? Wait a minute, something's a little off here, is it not? Verse 16, Samuel said to Saul, stop, let me tell you what the Lord said to me last night. Speak, he replied. And Samuel said, you may look small to yourself, but you are the head of the tribes of Israel. The Lord anointed you king over Israel, and the Lord sent you on a mission saying, go and prescribe the sinful Amalekites. In other words, you didn't do as you were told, okay? You can fill in the color on your own and the detail. And that is a fulcrum mission. Let's move down to verse 27. And Samuel turned to leave. Saul seized the corner of his robe and it tore. And Samuel said to him, the Lord has this day torn the kingship over Israel away from you and has given it to another who is worthier than you. Moreover, the glory of Israel does not deceive or change his mind, and he is not human that he should change his mind. But Saul pleaded, I did wrong. Please honor me in the presence of the elders of my people, in the presence of Israel, and come back with me until I have bowed low to the Lord your God. So Samuel followed Saul back, and Saul bowed low to the Lord. Samuel said, bring forward to me King Agag of Amalek. Agag approached him with faltering steps, and Agag said, bitter death is at hand. Samuel said, as your sword has bereaved women, so shall your mother be bereaved among women. And Samuel cut Agag down before the Lord at Gilgal. Samuel then departed for Ramah, and Saul went up to his home at Gibneh of Saul. Samuel never saw Saul again to the day of his death, but Samuel grieved over Saul because the Lord had regretted that he had made Saul king over Israel. Pretty tough stuff, yeah? And initially when we meet Saul, at least my reaction is that he's a fairly decent guy. However, why was it, at least cryptically, according to the Bible, that Saul was chosen king? You remember? He was tall and what? Tall and good looking.
Charlton Heston.
Charlton Heston. Pretty superficial criteria. And we do see that also, perhaps that too is a flashing amber light, where we have examples where the physicality of a person, a man or a woman, is something that not uncommonly leads to dead ends. Not in any way saying it's not important or has societal value, but perhaps too much too much, and it's fleeting in any event. It's so liminal. It lasts only for a time. All right, so that's what happens, and later we'll find out that one of the justifications that Saul gives as to why he did not carry forward the complete mission is a sense of fear for his troops. And I'm reminded a little bit of the story of Moses and Aaron when Moses goes up to Mount Sinai to receive the tablets, the 10 Commandments. And Aaron is down below at the base of the mountain. And what do they end up doing? They create a molten calf. And remember, the bull figure was in antiquity understood to be the platform of some monotheistic being. All right, so it's not as if the Israelites were worshiping this golden calf, but it was very clear that they shouldn't be doing that. And you really get the sense that Aaron was fearing his life, this mob mentality. Now, it's not completely congruent to the story of Saul, because Saul is the king, and presumably he's powerful. So let me digress and make the point that when we think of the tribal confederacy, the 12 tribes also goes on the east side of the Jordan River. The Confederates themselves, the tribes themselves, were often at each other's necks. To think that they were a harmonious group, they were not. And within the tribes themselves, there was infighting. It was once likened, and as dismissive as it sounds, I think there's some value, as almost a gang mentality. We think of the tribes as very productive and industrious, successful, but very often they were struggling politically, economically, socially, and so on. So the uprising, or the concern that Saul has for his troops, that they might rebel, and therefore he kept things that he shouldn't have, livestock. He kept the king Agag, the Agagite, the Amalekite, alive when he shouldn't have, for fear of his troops, is not totally unheard of. and with some substantiation, given the amount of infighting, the lack of singularity of purpose, a sense of unity within and among the tribes and others. All right, questions, comments up to this point?
Does Saul become king simply by Samuel's fiat, or does he have to lobby these disagreeable forces to describe in order to defend?
He has to present Saul, and not by Samuel's fiat, but ultimately at the behest of God. God leads Samuel to conclude that he's our man over there. At least that's the narrative. As the reader, one could safely conclude that it was finessed by God. Gary, did you want to come?
Well, Saul was king, he was a politician. And as a politician, he was responding to what he thought was the will of the Hebrews, of the people he governed. And for that, he was punished because God said, you weren't violent enough. You didn't do what I told you. You didn't kill everything I told you to kill. I'm on Saul's side. He did what he thought was the right thing for his people, and yet God was uncompromising.
God was uncompromising, and it raised a deeper question. And here we have to temper maybe our own reaction. Do we fear God? Not in an infantilizing sense, shame, 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 but do we have awe? Do we have a sense of transcendent respect, or do we fear our fellow man, our fellow human being? And I suspect there's probably wavering in all of us at different times. So next week, God willing, I'll be speaking from your Reverend Carpenter's pulpit, your church's pulpit. And I want to speak about the principle that God sees us. I actually believe that. I believe God hears our inner voice, sees our behavior. And I'm not embarrassed to say that. In fact, I find it intellectually satisfying. But I mention that in the heels of your question because for many of us, it's the things we do behind closed doors when we think no one's looking. And again, do we fear God or do we fear a fellow human being? And I'd only take slight issue with the premise of the question in that I think he was really a potentate, more than a politician. I really do either romanticize or project back into history that certainly the kings, the three kings of the unified confederacy, I'm using the term of the unified 12 tribes as a confederacy, they were strong as hell. And it's true, there was a lot of bickering, and there were, short of insurrection, there were groups, and I mean groups of people who would challenge the legitimacy of the kingship or have difficulty with his rule, but they were strong. And I'm not sure they gave a damn ultimately. In Saul's case, he admits, excuse me, let me be clear, I don't think they cared largely what the people felt. They had an army that they amassed, that they took care of, and that protected the king. But Saul, you see the human side of Saul. It's all easy for any of us to make judgments until and at which time we're on the hot seat. And again, I mean no disrespect to say that. We know that, but maybe we don't know it or think about it enough. Everything looks easy until we do it. It does. We were at the hockey game last night. We went to the fights and a hockey game broke out. These are rarefied athletes. They're really, truer words cannot be spoken, are in a league of their own. They make it look easy. It ain't easy. Anyway. All right. Any other questions? Any other comments? Let's move on. Yeah. Yes, please.
So I get why you spare the choice sheep and cattle. Why spare a God?
The short answer is I don't know. I don't. And my inclination as I understand or am led to perhaps conclude Saul's personality as such is that I think he's led often by compassion. And that's not a bad thing, but it can also get us in trouble also. You know, where is that balance between our mind and our hearts? I don't know. That's the art of living, not the science of living. But I actually think he had compassion for him. And by the way, you know, if you want to talk about incongruity here, so the whole premise of the attack against the Amalekites is hundreds of years later. The kingship is around 1240, 1230, and the Exodus was about 1100 or 1200. So it's a couple hundred years ago. Really? Really? And here you have collective punishment. You know, it's one thing to say I can't stand an individual. But then to diminish the individual's entire family or entire community or entire nation, that was a classic example of Theodor Herzl, who's not the founder of Zionism, but who believed that certainly post-World War I, where nationalism was on the rise, that Jewish nationalism, Jews are both a people and a religion, was very important to assert itself. The first Zionist conference was 98 or 58, I'm off, but it was sub 1900. Herzl goes to witness as a journalist Captain Alfred Dreyfus's trial in Paris. And what is met by him? Dreyfus was accused of being a traitor. Okay. And Herzl, he writes about this in his memoirs. He's outside the courthouse, and they're not saying death to Dreyfus. If the guy's a traitor, he's a traitor. I don't care if he's a Jew, a non-Jew, whoever. I don't care about his color, his gender. If the guy's, you know, I really do subscribe to the notion there are two races in this world, the decent and the indecent, period. That's Viktor Frankl's words, by the way, not mine, all right? But I do subscribe to that. It doesn't matter. So Herzl is met by death to the Jews. And this is a secular man, and he says, this is nuts. Again, you want to say death to Dreyfus, that's one thing. So back to the Amalekites. I mean, why is this festering for you know, down to today even? I mean, in terms of folk legend. Haman in the book of Esther was an Agagite. He was from the tribe of Amalek. And, you know, at a given point, let it go or single out an individual, but not a group. Group hatred? On what basis? And maybe therein lies also another message, an important message. Look, the digressions are so important, and that's how I love to read Bible. When I study Bible, and typically often with small group, it's not just the material; it's what the material leads us towards, and I hope in some small way you can identify with that.
Quick question.
Yeah.
What do you make of this phrase, God saying he regrets making this call?
I'm glad you mentioned that. It's not unique. Where does God allude to having expressed regret long before this? I'm not trying to throw the question back at you, folks. What comes to mind? What?
Genesis 6.
Yes, the creation of the world. Excuse me, the creation of humanity. Right? Yeah. It's interesting. So the deeper question is, well, is God in fact omniscient? All knowing, right? Well, if God is all knowing, wouldn't God know what was going to happen? It's a serious sidebar discussion. Yeah, not unique and problematic, if you ask me. On the other hand, if human beings are given free will, as I believe we are, as the quintessential creation of our creator, of God, then perhaps God, not in an Aristotelian sense, steps back and just simply observes the world, never to involve himself in the affairs of humanity, but gives us space also to make choices without necessarily guiding us directly, much like a puppet on a string, marionette on a string. Do you follow? I mean, on the one hand, I find it troubling. On the other hand, I find it incredibly refreshing. God is not in our back pocket. But it's interesting. So I and two others are studying the medieval philosopher Maimonides. And it's very fascinating because to study Maimonides is to study Christianity and Islam and Greek philosophy. And Maimonides comes down really, really hard. He's a Spanish Jew. And he comes down really, really hard on thinking that we can define God. I mean, that is the punch of his philosophy. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't engage. And I've shared this with you. One of the things as a non-Christian that I deeply admire within Christian theology is the whole notion of Jesus. I don't accept it, and I don't say that with any disrespect or any agenda. But how does one relate to an omni-everything, infinite creator? We relate to God in the way that we as human beings relate to our narrative, our existence. And I think Jesus becomes this exceptional paradigm. And Jews constantly push away from that, which I think it's too much. It becomes unsettling. I'm envious as a Jew. In the 1970s, there was, I think the 70s, there was a college group that started, what's it, WWJD or something? What would Jesus do? I wish more people, so change it. What, you know, as a Jew, what would Jewish law say? Or what would God say? I don't care, but the fact that Christians are doing this, I'm envious, all right? I'm not grandstanding. You guys know me well enough here. Well, I do grandstand, but I'm not grandstanding at all. Anyway, so it's troubling, and I think it's also really, really powerful that God has regret, at least as cited in this prophetic word. Okay. All right, let's move on. This is where we'll try to start leaving class for today. And I hope continually whet your appetite for the follow-through as we develop a better understanding, not only of the rise of King David, but King David himself. So let's look now at chapter 16. And I'm going to start with verse 1. Would someone call out a page, please?
48.
48 or 259, yes? Is that what we said? Okay. So chapter 16, 1 Samuel. And the Lord said to Samuel, how long will you grieve over Saul, since I have rejected him as king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and set out. Why is he filling his horn with oil?
Have some light.
Because what?
Have some light.
Oh, interesting. To burn the oil for light? No. Not giving up.
to be able to anoint.
Yes, Messiah, Mashiach is to pour, Mashiach. And that's, the king is poured oil, the oil is poured over him. He's not doused. It's not like the coach of a winning team where Gatorade is splattered all over him. In other words, get ready. You're going to appoint a successor to Saul. I am sending you to Jesse, the Bethlehemite, and again, Bethlehem is within the really environs of Jerusalem, and we're in the region here of Benjamin. This is, as I alluded to last week, really in many ways the most central part to the geography that's being described in the book of Samuel. It does vary farther down. It does go farther north and gives references to, I mentioned Philistia, the Philistines. Biblical scholars will debate exactly where they were, but they pretty much agree were a coastal people, probably to the southwest of Jerusalem and the tribe of Benjamin in the heart. Remember, as I said last week, that's where we get the name Palestine. It is not an Arabic term. Islam will not come on the scene for probably 2,000+ years. Okay. Jesus will not come on the scene for another 1,000 years, given the reign of the kings, the three, Saul, David, and Solomon. Okay. So I'm sending you to Jesse. The word Jesse, Yishai in Hebrew, is God's gift or God's existence. And here again, we can all identify this. This becomes the antecedent of the Messiah, the house of Jesse in Bethlehem. For I've decided on one of his sons to be king. Jesse is the son of Oched. He's the father of whom? David. And that's the son, of course, who's going to be selected. And Jesse is the grandson of Boaz and Ruth. And that's a fascinating book also. I love them all. What can I tell you? I really do. All right, so a little backdrop on them. Verse 2, Samuel replied, "How can I go? If Saul hears of it, he will kill me." The Lord answered, "Take a heifer with you and say, I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Invite Jesse to the sacrificial feast, and I will make known to you, and you shall anoint for me the one I point out to you." All right, for time's sake, I'm going to move a little bit forward here. It is important to note that Saul is sensing he's a lame duck, and trouble is in store for Saul. And that is going to really push him over the edge. He becomes, or he exhibits, this incredible paranoia, this obsession that that his days are numbered, both in terms of his kingship, no question about that, but by extension his life. And anyway, so here let's look at verse 6. When they arrived, he saw Eliab. Eliab is again one of the sons of Jesse. He thought, surely the Lord's anointed stands before him. But the Lord said to Samuel, pay no attention to his appearance or his stature, for I have rejected him. All right. We're going to peel through some of the brothers. Let's look at verse 9, chapter 16. Next, Jesse presented Shammah. Shammah's yet another son. Shammah can mean astonishment, or can mean God is there. We use it in vernacular Hebrew, Sham or Shammah, there, in that direction. Next, Jesse presented Shammah, and again he said, the Lord has not chosen this one either. Thus Jesse presented 7 of his sons before Samuel, and Samuel said to Jesse, the Lord has not chosen any of these. Then Samuel asked Jesse, I think this is just humorous, are these all the boys you have? Don't think for a minute there isn't humor in a text. Now, naturally, it's in the ear as well as the eye of the beholder. He replied, there is still the youngest. He is tending the flock. And Samuel said to Jesse, send someone to bring him, for we will not sit down and eat until he gets here. And lo and behold, that is David. And what does the word David, David in Hebrew, what does it mean? Beloved, loved one, Yedidyah, Ani Ledodi, the Dodi Li in the Song of Songs. I was at a Jewish summer camp for college students, and a great teacher stands up to try to entice us and heighten our interest in the Bible. So he starts to read some excerpts from the Song of Songs. If you've ever read the Song of Songs, it's literary erotica. It just is. I mean, you know it when you see it, and you know it when you hear it. Okay. And how and why it's in the Bible is a fascinating discussion. Why certain books were in, why others were in the Apocrypha, why those were in the Apocrypha. In any event, there's a great line. I am my beloved as my beloved is mine. Ani Ledodi David, beloved. David is beloved. All right, so he's our man for the sake of time. Let's move forward. I want to turn your attention to chapter 17. And this is such, I love this section. This is David and Goliath. You know the story. Goliath means giant. I think that's probably a reasonable interpretation, or has become associated with giant. By the way, who wrote the book? Malcolm Gladwell. His book, David and Goliath. If you're interested in any of Gladwell's books, I think this is a particularly interesting book, where he poses the thesis of the book is how can you use your disadvantage to your advantage? David is the quintessential example of that. He's a shepherd, and I'll dispel the notion that shepherds are, pastoral and meek and perhaps peaceful. They're not at all, okay? But I'll come back to that in a minute. But David certainly will use his disadvantage to his advantage. And what ends up happening? All right, so the Philistines are lining up against the Israelites, and they're calling them out to battle. And Goliath stands 10 feet tall. And, scientists and medical experts might say that he had acromegaly, a hormonal imbalance that is not a good thing, that leads to impaired vision and other deficits, also stability on your feet, and excessive height. You just grow excessively tall. So he's a big guy, and David is not he's not diminutive, but he's small, okay? And he's not physically powerful. At least his presence is not such. So look at verse 8 in chapter 17. He stopped and called out to the ranks of Israel, and he said to them, why should you come out to engage in battle? I am the Philistine champion, and you are Saul's servant. Choose one of your men and let him come down against me. If he bests me in combat and kills me, we will become your slaves. But if I best him and kill him, You shall be our slaves and serve us. You follow what's happening? And both sides are on each side of a ravine and they're yelling across each other, and and the big game is on Sunday afternoon, right? The rivalry, but it's a rivalry of blood, and it's serious, and it's not a joke. In any event, what ends up happening? Look at verse 17. Jesse said to his son David, take an ephah and the parched corn and 10 loaves of bread for your brothers and carry them quickly to your brother's camp. In other words, excuse me, David, go out and feed your brothers. They're out on the line of battle. All right. And the tension is mounting. So now David physically is in the location of where the battle's to occur. And verse 24. When the men of Israel saw the man, they fled in terror, and the men of Israel were saying among themselves, do you see that man coming out? He comes out to defy Israel. The man who kills him will be rewarded by the king with great riches. Look at verse 28. When Eliab, the oldest brother, heard him speaking to the men, Eliab became angry with David and said, why did you come down here, and with whom did you leave those few sheep in the wilderness? Which was really a belittling thing. You have such a parochial job. We're doing the real heavy stuff because they're elitist and they're the big military guys and so on and so forth. I know your impudence and your impertinence. You came down to watch the fighting, but David replied, what have I done now? I was only asking. Again, that family dynamic, right? And he turned away from him and towards someone else, and he asked the same question. The troops gave him the same answer as before. So what ends up happening? Let's turn to, let's look ahead. Verse 39. David girded his sword over his garment, then he tried to walk, but he was not used to it. What happens? So David is a volunteer. He's going to slay Goliath, and they load him up with all this armament. And this is actually kind of funny. So here you have, I don't know, a 5'4", 5'5", rather slight man. He is described as good looking and nice complexion and so on. And you can just see him clomping along with all this armament, right? That's not the way David fights. So let me come back to the idea of a shepherd. Shepherds are really tough, really tough. First of all, the conditions are not ideal when they lead their flock to pasture. It's not as if they work on a ranch. They have to travel great distances. They're not looked favorably upon because they go through people's properties, and livestock feed on the greenery or whatever is there on another person's property or disputed land, so they don't win favor. The nights are cold, very cold, and in parts of Israel during the winter months, it can snow, and snow can accumulate, not for many days, not uncommonly a day or two. And it's physically demanding, on top of which they have to protect their flock. Their job is to bring the flock back, presumably healthier and fatter. So they have to protect against predators, animals that want to prey on the flock. And how do they defend themselves? Any number of ways, but primarily using a sling. What are called slingers, not swingers. We'll find that about David later on. But and it is very important to note that those who study ballistics understand how pinpoint accurate a slinger can be, and the power, the velocity of the stone that is released, likened to the European 43 millimeter gun. Very powerful. And that's how David fights. So in so many words, he says, I can't walk with all this armament. And he sheds it, and he does take a little bag of rounded and smooth stones. And this is what happens. Look at verse 41. The Philistine, meanwhile, was coming closer to David, preceded by his shield bearer. Goliath had difficulty walking, so he had a shield bearer walk with him. Again, medically, it's believed that this is a modern commentary, but with some veracity given the storyline here. When the Philistine, that is Goliath, caught sight of David, he scorned him, for he was but a boy, ruddy and handsome. And the Philistine called out to David, "Am I a dog that you come against me with sticks?" Here again, another example that Goliath is not a well man. He has impaired vision. David doesn't come after him with sticks. He has a sling, one. That's it. Anyway, the Philistine cursed David by his gods, and the Philistine said to David, "Come here." He couldn't chase David. Physically, he wasn't able. Goliath wasn't. He said, "You come to me." And the truth is that David did come close to him, he would lose. Goliath is big and strong, and David would get killed. And Goliath can't chase after him. "And I will give your flesh to the birds of the sky and the beasts of the fields." So, the end of the story. David takes a rock, he slings it over his head, he releases it, and with pinpoint accuracy, in a place where there is no armament on Goliath's head, he kills him. And then he severs his head as indicated and essentially reports back to Saul. And immediately he is elevated to the rank of a hero, and he's paraded around town. But things go from good to bad, and they go from good to bad rather quickly. What ends up happening is that Saul becomes very jealous of David, to the point where Saul wants David killed. And David, it's interesting, who's not officially, he's officially king, but he's not stated as such in that he was selected to be king. David shows this incredible loyalty to Saul, because in David's eyes, Saul is still the king. And there's an interesting parallel that we'll see a little later in January when we encroach on the second work of Samuel, the case of Uriah. Uriah is one of David's soldiers, and he's incredibly loyal to David. But the twist is just so perverse, because David, who's now king and powerful king and proven to be powerful king beyond the episode with Goliath in terms of his military ability and his military success, there's a cruel change of events. He will send Uriah to the front line to be killed, this loyal servant. So here David is incredibly loyal to King Saul. That's all he knows is his king. Anyway, what ends up happening, and in this I'm going to let you go because I'm going to abuse your time. But Saul becomes ever more filled with anxiety and fear, understanding that things are not heading in a good direction. What does he do? Let's really jump ahead, though I'll try to pick up maybe some of additional high points with you, God willing, in January. A few that I think are also worthy of making mention. But let's look at chapter 28. And with this, I'll lead you. Very, very provocative section. Call out a page, folks.
260.
260.
234.
And 234. All right, chapter 28. At that time, the Philistines mustered their forces for war to take the field against Israel. Achish said to David, You know, of course, that you and your men must march out with my forces. David answered Achish, you surely know what your servant will do. In that case, Achish replied to David, I will appoint you my bodyguard for life. Now Samuel had died, and all Israel made lament for him, and he was buried in his own town of Ramah. And Saul had forbidden recourse to ghosts and familiar spirits of the land. That was looked down upon. Certain intermediaries in that regard who might be able to connect with the deceased. And why was it looked down upon? Because presumably they would tell your future. And that was not in concert with certainly Israelite tradition, perhaps a reaction to other indigenous cultures within the broader land. So what ends up happening? Saul disguised himself. Let's go back. Let's look at verse 6. And Saul inquired of the Lord, but the Lord did not answer him either by dreams or by Urim or the prophets. Urim are oracles. And that's what the priests in Israel, the high priest in Israel, would wear on his breastplate, as if he was the adjudicator on earth. Something similar to what the Pope might be, or at least that becomes somewhat of the antecedent for the contemporary Pope within Catholicism. I'll leave you on that. Then Saul said to his courtiers, find me a woman who consults ghosts. What do you guys have on that? Consults ghosts or what? So that I can go to her and inquire through her. And his courtiers told him that there was a woman in Endor who consulted ghosts. Doesn't say witch, by the way, though she's referred to as the witch of Endor. What does Endor mean? One interpretation is Ayendor, one who can see the generations. All right, so a medium of some sort. Saul disguised himself. He put on different clothes and set out with two men. All right, just to fast forward here. So he tricks this woman and he says, basically, I want you to pull up someone from the dead. And who does he want to pull up from the dead? Samuel. He wants to plead to Samuel because he's really worried. David is on the rise. Saul is incredibly emotionally unstable now. He's obsessed. And by the way, on a personal level, within, say, a family or within a relationship or within a workspace, oh, they have that new young intern over there. You know, my job may be on the ropes. And everyone wants the new young and the latest and the greatest. Not everyone, but you understand the point. So again, use this as metaphor as much as it's descriptive here. He's really afraid. And he screwed up, and no one's letting go of that. He didn't kill the Amalekites in the manner in which he was commanded to do. So he asks the witch of Endor. Saul swore to her, verse 10, by the Lord, as the Lord lives, you won't get into trouble over this. And then the woman recognized Samuel, and she shrieked loudly. I'm reading ahead just to be quick. King answered, don't be afraid. The king answered her, verse 13, don't be afraid. What do you see? And the woman said to Saul, I see a divine being coming up from the earth. What does he look like? He asked her. It is an old man coming up, she said, and he's wrapped in a robe. Then Saul knew that it was Samuel, and he bowed low in homage to the face of his ground. That's what he wants. He wants to talk to Samuel. And Samuel's dead. And this is a powerful statement, and you can run with this in almost any direction you want. Do we speak to our deceased, dead loved ones? I must tell you, I do. There was a time I actually I have a sister who died 18 years ago. She should rest in peace. There was a time I really felt she was the guardian angel of my children. I really did. And I'm a rational thinker, all right? But we're not machines. We're human beings. We're emotionally complex. And in this case, Saul is really scared. I keep emphasizing it. I keep going back to that description. That's exactly what's happening. So what then ends up, verse 15, Samuel said to Saul, this is a classic. Why have you disturbed me and brought me up? Leave me alone, you know. And Saul answered, I'm in great trouble. All right, anyway, so we'll leave it at that. But what ends up happening, of course, is Samuel is unrelenting. He says to Saul, no, you know, your time is up. David's on the rise, and that's exactly what's going to happen. We'll perhaps begin in January, the 2 sessions there, a little bit with the Witch of Endor. It's called the Witch of Endor or the Medium of Endor, because it does raise so many, I think, provocative and interesting questions. The plot thickens. David is on the rise. And what I find, and I'll leave you this with the last point, aside from the relevance, the incredible relevance of biblical text, what I also find is how real it is. There's no powder coating. It's real. It talks in a language that often, certainly in the Hebrew, is crude and direct, but it deals with issues that all of us at different times of our life and in different settings, I think, can both apply and relate to. Wish you all a wonderful Sunday. God bless each and every one, and I'll see you next Sunday in church.